The MET, Measures of Effective Teaching, was what it stood for, paid for by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They pay for a lot of things. I don't know if you've noticed this. And they sponsored this very, very large project having to do with answering the question, what makes for good teaching? Now, many of us thought we had answered that question a long time ago, but they conducted this very large study. So we'd like to just share some of the findings because they have implications for how we observe teaching in everyday schools. So first of all, let me just tell you quickly about where it came from. There was a report in 2009 conducted by a group called the New Teacher Project, and they looked at the way teachers were evaluated in some school districts around the US, some large ones, and discovered that virtually every teacher was judged to be at the top of whatever the scale was, which would be good news if anybody actually believed it to be true. But you can see that in Akron, for example, Akron, Ohio, that is, that big blue circle, pale blue circle, are those teachers whose performance was judged to be outstanding, and then down to what they called very good and satisfactory. Literally none, zero, unsatisfactory. And in Chicago, it was actually a little bit worse. They call them different things, excellent, superior, etc. And, you know, everybody said, well, this would be wonderful if it were true. But in fact, in these same schools, there are students who are not learning anything much, certainly not enough. Now, let's put this in context here for a moment. These are public schools, state schools. They take public money. The public has a right to expect good teaching, period. And so the school needs a way to make that happen. And you can't make for good teaching, you can't help have good teaching if you don't know what you have now. And so the focus on teacher evaluation in the US has been sort of, I mean, it's been enormous, and not always positive, but it has been well motivated. I'm convinced of that, because it's been motivated by the observation that everybody thinks that teaching is good when in fact it can't be. And there are, of course, a number of factors that contribute to student learning, but the quality of teaching is the single most important one in the school. So you have to start with knowing what is. Now, the other thing they found, and this was quite shocking in its own way, is that these rather poor systems for evaluating teachers, not only were they not effective for student learning, they were not fair to teachers either. And so this is the same data, but from Los Angeles. And that big circle is all the teachers in LA. The blue part of the circle, which is virtually everyone, are those teachers in Los Angeles whose own performance was judged to be at the satisfactory level or above. Almost everybody. But you see that little tiny yellow sliver? If you pull that out and analyze it over on the right, the green part of that little circle represent, which is not quite but nearly half, are those teachers whose own performance was judged to be unsatisfactory, but whose students outperformed the students of the teachers in the blue. Well, this got people's attention, as you can imagine, because people said, well, good Lord, we're not even doing it right. I mean, for the tiny number of people whom we call unsatisfactory, some of them aren't, clearly aren't. So what to do about that? So so another thing to think about here is then, in order to have a system of teacher evaluation, it's got to be accurate and reliable and valid, period. That's what makes it fair. That's what makes it equitable. It should also be educative. And by that, you remember that little slide I had this morning with the curve moving? That's what you want. You want to not only be able to know how good the teaching is, but you need a system that makes it better. And the most we know about that is that the system itself should include the provision for teacher self-assessment and reflection on practice and professional conversation. That is, this is what we, and let me just pull back to something I had said at the very, very outset, and then Mark also mentioned that, and it sounds stupid to say it, you know, but learning is done by the learner. Right? Now, let's remember how, at least in the US, and I'm going to predict that it's not that different here, here's how a typical observation works that is done for the purpose of evaluation. Let's say I'm the teacher and you're the principal. You come to my class, you watch me teach, you take notes, you go away, you write up your notes, you come back, and you tell me about my teaching. And I would only ask you who's doing the work. And actually it gets worse. Now we're in your office and we're discussing this lesson, and I know that from the standpoint of that conversation, all I really have to do is endure it. You will eventually stop talking, and I can leave. And so, you know, we shouldn't be surprised when teachers don't learn from that, because they're not doing anything. They are completely passive. And so then the challenge becomes a little different one, and this is where the video comes in. Because it makes it gives you a common frame of reference. So now, if Mark observed me, then we could look at this together. And we could pause it, and we could discuss it, and we could see how things could have been better. Or he could ask me to hypothesize how it could have been better. Or we could solve a problem together. But it becomes a very different exercise then. It's not nearly so judgmental, and my role as the teacher is not nearly so passive. So I think that's the big idea here. And at least in the US, we are in a position where we have to do evaluation. Absolutely have to do it. And it has to be done well, and it might actually be challenged in court if it's seemed to be unfair. And so our efforts have been to make it fair. Now, in any evaluation system, you know, you've got a couple of dimensions. You've got rigor, and you have level of stakes. And so, of course, when you have 2 dimensions, you've got 4 quadrants. And you can populate these quadrants by a few, and the 2 systems I mentioned this morning, the National Board Certification and Praxis 3, those are both highly rigorous systems and highly consequential. The Praxis 3, which is licensing, if a teacher fails that, they can't teach. They can't teach. National Board, if you're successful at that, you are rewarded in some way. Sometimes recognized, always recognized, but sometimes you are qualified for higher status or more money or something. So it is high stakes, but only in a positive direction, not in a negative one. Nothing bad happens to you if you fail. And then you can see the other quadrants. Mentoring tends to be, of course, low stakes. It's not evaluation. But traditional evaluation systems have been, in the US at least, both low stakes and low rigor. The ones I worry about, of course, and I think we should all worry, are the bottom right. High stakes and low rigor. And I do worry that if we don't do this work well, that's where we'll be, because the schools don't have a choice about whether it's high stakes or not. The only thing they can change is the rigor. And it's just in their interest, it's in everybody's interest, that it be rigorous. So why educative? This is the same slide as this morning. We have to figure out ways to move it. We have to figure out ways. And it's just an imperative. It's just an imperative. So we'd like to just share with you a few things that we learned from the MET study. Mark, should I just let you talk about this? You know more about this, I think.
So it's interesting that the MET study focused the positioning of this around the concept of feedback, which was there were 2 reports that were issued. The one on the left was all about feedback, when it was fundamentally a kind of measurement study. And I'm going to talk about the concept in the US that has gained a lot of traction, this notion of multiple measures, both the risks around those multiple measures and the pursuit of validity around those multiple measures. So I showed this to you earlier. These are sort of a look at where the study was conducted and the size of it. You see the list of the frameworks as well that were part of it. Did I hear correctly that Bob Pianta has been here in the past? So Bob's the class framework, which is by and large an early childhood framework, which he adapted for the study to be a K-12 framework. There were 3 subject matter rubrics. The MQI, which was developed initially by Deborah Ball and Heather Hill at the University of Michigan, is now really Heather Hill's instrument. She is at Harvard. Plato, which was by and large a middle school English language arts instrument developed by Pam Grossman at Stanford, which she has also expanded to be more of a K9 instrument. And then we developed an instrument for science. That's how we came to be filming the biology labs that I referenced earlier with Linda Darling-Hammond and Ray Pichon at Stanford also. And part of the way we were able to sort of learn a lot about this whole business about getting raters accurate is that we had to hire, train, and certify 1,000 raters. And we had to do so with folks that we never met. They all worked online. And then we scored all these videos. It was about 50,000 scored lessons at the end of the day. So what came out of it? So it certainly became to sort of celebrate the framework for teaching as the sort of leading instrument in the US. It shifted the conversation around to feedback in ways that we'll talk about, and it elevated this whole notion of student surveys. This has gotten a lot of traction in the US, actually polling the students on their perception of their teachers. And we can talk some more about that as we get into this. It advocated for video. It made a big point about multiple observers. So we learned that even trained and certified observers, reliability goes up. I'll show more about this in a bit when you have multiple observers. It made a strong argument that we rethink the way we do in professional development investments in the US and start using aggregate data about a district's teaching forces effectiveness to decide what to invest in. It has really triggered this notion of web-based PD and focused, and I'll show some of the kinds of analytics that they're trying to use to sort of benchmark and compare teachers to one another. And finally, we're sort of at a point of this. We have this movement in the States around these new sets of student learning standards called the Common Core in the math area, to use the example that we were talking about in the earlier conversation of Japan. The US is trying to get away from the sort of mile-wide, inch-deep math curriculum into a much deeper math curriculum, which most teachers have never been prepared to teach to that level. So at a high level, in designing evaluation systems, these are the sort of three big ideas, right? The first is actually around sort of high-level design around setting expectations, using multiple measures, and balancing weights. So the big expectation setter is moving away from, and we'll show a slide about this in a minute, this notion that everybody's going to be above average, to an expectation where everyone's going to be in a more developing phase of their teaching. We'll talk about weights and measures in a minute. The second big idea is all about accuracy and validity, which underscored the importance of training observers. And then the third is to have a sort of a diagnostic process of taking these data and investing in teachers. The whole, this educative point that Charlotte is making has been emphasized a great deal in the study. So just a couple of, I made the point about the student surveys being a sort of one of the new components that's being introduced. These are questions that are asking much more sort of dispositionally whether or not students understand the content that's being delivered to them. Do teachers clarify the content for them? Do teachers believe in their ability to learn, and other things that get at the affect of teaching? On the balancing of weights, interestingly, you'll see data that shows that there's a big popular movement in the States around value-added measures, modeling of the teacher effect on students. The study is actually recommending a more balanced weight approach, and I'll explain why in a minute when we get into this. This is the study ran sort of 4 different scenarios of weights. So the brown in each of these is the achievement gains of the students, again, as measured on value-added measures of those achievement gains. The blue represents the impact of the observations as a measure of teacher effectiveness, and the green represents the student surveys. And so these are just simply different weighting measures or methodologies. where the left is extreme value add, extremely prejudiced on the student achievement side, and the right is much more heavily weighted towards observational data. And they ran the data to get at what would you learn off of those different models. And it's interesting, and some of it not terribly surprising. If you want to predict value add outcomes on high stakes state tests, at least in the US, the best measure is the value add measure of student achievement on high stakes tests. That's what the first one sort of tells you. But what they also did in the Met study is they gave much more constructed response items tests to kids. So the state tests tend to be reductive. They're bubble tests. They gave tests in reading and mathematics that got at higher order thinking skills, which are theoretically the direction the US is trying to go in. And you see that there, actually, the different models had very similar predictive correlations. But from a reliability standpoint, it turns out that you get a lot of information out of the student surveys and the classroom observations that's critically important. And at the risk of telling you something that's painfully obvious to all of you, you can't give feedback to a teacher on a value-added score of a student. If you've ever seen these value-added models, you get a ranking order of where teachers come out. It gives you no useful information to get better. And it is and there are people, economists mainly in the United States, who are arguing that's really should be the only measure of teaching. I mean, just to show you how crazy our political debate is about this, that there are those who would just rule out observations altogether. And so, it was important to kind of underscore the importance of the reliability. You want to talk about this one?
Let me just add one quick thing, and that is that the emphasis on the student results, that is, if there are people who are not educators who will say, well, what's the purpose of schools anyway? It's for students to learn. And so if you want to find out who the best teachers are, look and see which teachers produce the best learning, the most learning. And we have legislation in, we have 50 states, 50 systems. We have new legislation in about 45 of them, all around teacher evaluation. And in some of them appear to be written with the aim in mind of firing the least effective teachers only. And if that's your only aim, then you could do what they do. But if also your aim is you're worried about, let's say there are 5% teachers who shouldn't be teaching, there are 95% of teachers who could get better. Because when we make a big point about professional learning and professional development, it is not, at least for me, I don't say that because I think the quality of teaching is poor and it has to be fixed. It's not that. It's that teaching is so hard that it's never perfect. It could always be better. And so why throw away this opportunity then to help teaching improve? And then I'll just say one other thing in terms of, in light of accuracy. I'm sure it's true here. In the US, you can't get a driver's license without passing a test, right? I fail to understand why it is that people can evaluate teachers for high stakes and not have to demonstrate that they can do it, which is what we've had for all up to now. And so we developed this assessment for observers based on the work in the Met study, and the immediate reaction of principals where they've been required to take it is panic. They say, well, I've been a principal for 15 years. Nobody ever asked me to demonstrate my proficiency. What is this? So it's been a challenge, but nothing like passing the test for people to then become advocates for it, and they do. But this has been a big shift in the U.S. around accuracy, around educative systems, not just ranking people. Okay, so, here, I'll just continue here. Mark just mentioned the student surveys. One of the, quote, multiple measures they used in the Met study was surveys of student perceptions of their teacher and of the class. And they discovered, which was very interesting and a new finding for many people, that the student perceptions actually predicted pretty well. They correlated really highly with the actual results that happened in those classrooms. And so and now the Met study treated the student perception surveys as a separate measure. They sort of ran the correlation separately. That's one way to do it. I actually think a better way to do it is to think of the student perception surveys not as a different measure, but a different window on the same measure. That is, for instance, before lunch, actually, I mentioned that one of the components in my framework for teaching has to do with the teacher's clarity of explanations. And I can observe in a class and be watching for that, and I can take my notes around the clarity of a teacher, and my own reaction will be based on the fact that I understood it perfectly, it was very clear, and maybe I looked at the kids to see whether they seemed to be following, or they had puzzled expressions on their faces or so on. I can infer whether this explanation was clear to the students or not. I could also ask them. I could ask them directly. And so so what we're doing, we're involved in a project in Texas, actually. Aldine is a place near Houston, where we've taken my components in the framework for teaching and found questions in a survey instrument that we're piloting there that seem to be getting at the same construct. And we're doing a comparison right now, a research study to see, when you actually observe a teacher for these things and when you ask the students for what is arguably the same thing, how do they match up? I'm hoping that they will essentially agree. I don't know what we'll do about it if they don't, but it's important to know, and we'll find out. So that's what that project's about. What's next?
So this takes that really I'll build on it. This takes this a step further here. This is taking the across the bottom here on the excuse me, the bottom of the graph are the domain 2 and 3 domains of Charlotte's framework. Those are the individual components, and these are different. The colored combinations are the way in which these student survey questions get synthesized. They're synthesized around the concepts of kids' perception of the control in the classroom that the teacher is asserting, kids' perception of the challenge that the teacher gives them, and kids' perception of the support that they claim to receive from their teacher. So this is just looking at him, and obviously what's encouraging is that when you take the F, high control, high challenge, and high support, it correlates very high to Charlotte's overall domain 2 and domain 3 scores. So it's just a further tease out of that information. So on the, I want to make one of the crucial points that I wanted to make sure that we left. So just to sort of review the bidding on the language in here. So obviously the validity is the degree to which the instrument predicts achievement. Reliability is the degree to which the system's results are not attributable to measurement error. And at the center of the issue of measurement error is the accuracy of the observers. So this is the data that relates to what I said earlier about looking at shorter video and having multiple observers. So you see the reliability going from 0.51 to as much as 0.72 by looking at different combinations of observers looking at the lesson. So the lowest level of reliability is one observer looking at one lesson. The second, as it sort of incrementally goes up, is one observer looking at 2 lessons. The third is 2 observers looking at 2 lessons. The fourth is one observer and then taking little 15-minute segments and having peers actually look at the lessons. And you can see the sort of various combinations. When it's broken up, when the blue is broken up into that 3 slices of pie, that's 3 15-minute observations. When it's a solid blue circle, it's a single pure observation. But the goal here, obviously, was to try to figure out statistically what is the number of observers that you need to have in order to get greater levels of accuracy. And I think the sort of rule of thumb would be that it's better to have more observers looking at more lessons for less time each lesson than to have one observer spend tons of time with one teacher on his or her own. And that really sort of drove the biggest recommendation. This gets at just, given the interest of time here, I'm not going to dwell on it, but it just shows how over time, on each component of Charlotte's framework, you get as you move from 15 minutes to 45 minutes, you get slight variations on the scores, but overall very high levels of reliability around 15 minutes of observation. The final thing, which I just sort of want to mention, that is an observation that we've made about the time it takes to do this work. We've been looking at various combinations of informal and formal observations and informal walkthroughs. And if you think about the notion of a single principal having to do all of this by himself or herself, in hours, it adds up to an enormous amount of time. And one of the things we're advocating, both because we think it allows for more professional conversation, and it relieves the burden on being the sole purview of one individual, the principal, is that you democratize the observation process by having many more people trained and certified so that they can look at one another and then engage in the kind of professional conversation that is ultimately going to yield the kind of growth that you're after. We've given a lot of thought to various models for doing this, for giving feedback and continuing the process. That's a longer conversation than I think we have time for today. But those are the sort of headlines that I think we want to share at this point around the MET study. There is an enormous amount of additional data that's provided, and for those of you who don't already have access to the reports or would like us to share the reports, we'd certainly be happy to do so. So that's it.
Oh, excuse me. Hey, I just thought I would just supplement this by just telling you about a study that was done in Cincinnati, actually over an extended period of time, 5 years. I think 5, or maybe more. Anyway, in Cincinnati, they had a system where teachers were formally evaluated only once every 5 years, and so they had the opportunity to do, in effect, a longitudinal study. And so what they did, they tracked student learning, student achievement on a test, according to the year in which a teacher was evaluated. And so there were the years before the teacher was evaluated, and then the years of the evaluation, and then afterwards. And what they found, I think, surprised even them, which was that in the year a teacher was being evaluated, their students actually showed more learning than they had in the years before. But that was good to know. But what was really interesting to know was that in the years following, the 3 or 4 years after, that was all they had the data for, the student learning continued to improve. That is, it had a residual benefit. And the researchers, when they were asked to, obviously in the paper, they tried to explain this, and they could only hypothesize, but their hypothesis was that in the year that a teacher was being evaluated, first of all, they looked at the instrument and said, oh, okay, this is what the teacher, which I'm going to be evaluated on, I guess I better do these things, or so, right? Like use questioning skills well and be clear in my, etc. But then, what the researchers concluded was that once they started doing those things and found that they actually were effective, they continued to do them. And then, not surprisingly, correspondingly, the students continued to show good learning. So that was actually quite encouraging news, I thought, that teacher evaluation, which we tend to think of as a necessary evil, that it actually might do some good if we do it well. So I just wanted to add that as another research finding.